There is a frequency that was removed from music, not a genre, not a style, not an instrument, or a technique or a tradition. A frequency, a specific vibration measured in cycles per second that was the standard tuning reference for virtually all Western music for centuries, and that was, in a single decade, replaced by a different frequency. The replacement was deliberate, it was institutional, it was international, and it was never explained to the public that would spend the rest of their lives hearing every piece of music calibrated to the new standard without knowing the old one had existed. The frequency was 432 Hz. The note A, the reference pitch against which every other note in the Western musical system is tuned, vibrated at 432 cycles per second for the majority of modern musical history. Not universally, not without variation. Concert pitch fluctuated across centuries and geographies, but the center of gravity, the pitch around which the variations clustered, sat at or near 432 Hz from the classical period through the early 20th century. The instruments of Mozart, of Beethoven, of Bach were tuned to reference pitches that clustered in the range of 415 to 432 Hz. The music you know by these composers, the music that is held up as the pinnacle of Western artistic achievement, was written for and performed at a tuning standard significantly lower than what you hear today. Today, the standard is 440 Hz. Every orchestra, every piano, every recording studio, every radio broadcast, every digital tuner, every instrument sold in every music shop on Earth is calibrated to A equals 440 Hz. The standard is so universal, so unquestioned, so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of music production and distribution that most musicians never think to ask where it came from. It feels like physics, like a property of sound itself, like the only possible tuning. It isn't. It was chosen. And the choice was made in a specific decade, by specific people, under specific circumstances that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with something else entirely. This raises a simple but critical question. Who changed the frequency and why? Start with the timeline. Because the timeline is where the official narrative begins to fracture. In 1834, the Stuttgart Conference proposed A equals 440 Hz as a standard pitch. The proposal was not adopted. In 1859, the French government established A equals 435 Hz as the official standard, a compromise pitch that was lower than 440. In 1885, the Music Commission of the Italian government set A equals 432 Hz as their standard, explicitly choosing the lower pitch. In 1917, the American Federation of Musicians adopted A equals 440 Hz. In 1939, an international conference in London established A equals 440 Hz as the global standard. But here's the date that the official timeline glosses over. 1934. The year that the German Standards Institute, under the influence of Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda ministry, formally promoted A equals 440 Hz as the standard concert pitch. The Nazis adopted 440 before the rest of the world followed. And the rest of the world did follow 5 years later at the 1939 London Conference in a decision that the standard narrative treats as a technical standardization and that the deeper record reveals as something far more entangled with the political currents of the decade. The silence was deafening when I started tracing who attended the 1939 conference and what arguments were made, because the conference didn't just rubber stamp a technical proposal. It overrode active opposition. The French delegation opposed 440, preferring to maintain their existing 435 standard. Multiple musicians and acousticians argued for lower standards, including 432. The arguments for 440 were not acoustic, they were not therapeutic, they were not musical, they were industrial. Standardization for the sake of standardization, uniformity for the sake of broadcast technology. The radio industry needed a fixed reference pitch so that instruments and broadcasts would be compatible across stations and borders. The pitch wasn't chosen because it sounded better. It was chosen because it transmitted better. Because the broadcast infrastructure that was being built across the Western world in the 1930s required a single standard, and 440 was the number that the most powerful institutional voices at the table pushed for. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now here's where the investigation splits from historical curiosity into something that made me put down my research and sit in silence. Because the difference between 432 Hz and 440 Hz isn't just a number, it's a vibration, a physical event. Sound is not abstract, it's mechanical. It's pressure waves moving through air, striking the eardrum, vibrating the ossicles of the middle ear, converting to electrical impulses in the cochlea, and being processed by the auditory cortex into what you experience as music. Every frequency produces a distinct pattern of vibration, and the body, which is approximately 60% water, responds to those vibrations not just through the ears, but through every cell that the sound waves penetrate. The deeper I went into the acoustic research, the more I found that the difference between 432 and 440 isn't trivial. 8 Hz, 8 cycles per second. A difference so small it's barely perceptible as pitch, but a difference that produces measurably different patterns when you make sound visible. Pull up cymatics research. Cymatics is the study of visible sound vibration, typically demonstrated by placing fine particles or water on a vibrating surface and observing the geometric patterns that specific frequencies produce. The patterns are not random, they're geometric. They're reproducible, and they're frequency-specific. Different frequencies produce different patterns with mathematical precision. When A equals 432 Hz is used as the reference pitch, the frequencies of the notes in the Western scale align with a set of numbers that produce cymatic patterns of remarkable order and symmetry, clean geometries, balanced shapes, patterns that resemble the geometric forms found in nature, in crystalline structures, in biological growth patterns, in the mathematical relationships that govern organic form. When A equals 440 Hz is used, the same notes produce different cymatic patterns. The patterns are slightly asymmetric, slightly disordered, still structured, but with a quality that researchers have described as agitated compared to the 432-based patterns. The difference is visible, it's reproducible, it's not imaginary, and it raises a question that the music industry has never addressed. If the visible patterns produced by 432-based tuning are more ordered and more aligned with natural geometric forms than the patterns produced by 440-based tuning, what are the implications for the bodies that absorb these vibrations? The official explanation collapses here. Because the official position is that the difference between 432 and 440 is imperceptible, that the human ear can barely detect the distinction, that the choice of reference pitch is arbitrary, that 440 is as good as any other number, and that the conspiracy theories about 432 are pseudoscience promoted by people who don't understand acoustics, and the ear argument is partially true. Most listeners cannot identify the difference between 432 and 440 in an A-B comparison without training. The pitch difference is small, but the ear is not the only organ that processes sound. The body processes sound, and the body's response to frequency is not limited to conscious perception. Infrasound below the threshold of hearing affects the body. Ultrasound above the threshold of hearing affects the body. The body responds to frequency across a range far wider than the ear can consciously detect. And 8 Hz, the difference between 432 and 440, falls within the range of the brain's own operating frequencies. The deeper I went into the neuroscience, the more this detail became impossible to ignore, because the human brain generates electrical oscillations at specific frequencies. Delta waves, 1 to 4 Hz, theta waves, 4 to 8 Hz, alpha waves, 8 to 12 Hz, beta waves, 12 to 30 Hz. The frequency ranges of brainwave activity are well documented, and their association with specific mental states is established science. Delta with deep sleep, theta with meditation and deep relaxation, alpha with calm alertness, beta with active thinking and anxiety. 8 Hz, the difference between 432 and 440. 8 Hz sits at the boundary between theta and alpha, the transition zone between deep meditative states and calm wakefulness, the frequency that the brain operates at during the most integrated, most balanced, most physiologically coherent states that neuroscience has measured. And here's where the connection between tuning pitch and brain frequency becomes more than coincidental. Because 432 Hz is a mathematical harmonic of 8 Hz. Divide 432 by powers of 2. 432, 216, 108, 54, 27, 13.5, 6.75. The overtone series that descends from 432 passes through frequency ranges that correspond to brainwave states. The math connects the tuning reference to the brain's own operating frequencies through the harmonic series that governs all sound. 440 doesn't share this relationship. Divide 440 by the same series. 440, 220, 110, 55, 27.5, 13.75, 6.875. The numbers don't align with the same brainwave boundaries. The harmonic relationship between the tuning reference and the brain's operating frequencies is disrupted, not dramatically, subtly, by exactly the 8 Hz that separates the two standards. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision when you look at what else aligns with 432, because 432 isn't just a musical number. It's a geometric one, a cosmological one. The number appears in measurement systems and natural constants with a frequency that has fascinated mathematicians for centuries. The radius of the Sun is approximately 432,000 miles. The number of seconds in 12 hours is 43,200. The precessional cycle of the equinoxes, the great year that measures the Earth's axial wobble, is approximately 25,920 years, and 25,920 divided by 60 is 432. The Great Pyramid's base perimeter in the original Egyptian measurements relates to 432 through specific mathematical conversions that researchers have debated for decades. Each of these correspondences, taken individually, might be coincidence. Together, they suggest that 432 isn't a random number. It's a number embedded in the mathematical relationships that govern planetary and solar geometry. A number that resonates, literally, with the physical systems it exists within. A number that the ancient world may have recognized and that the modern world, in 1939, replaced with a number that doesn't carry the same resonances. Here's where I need you to look at who resisted the change, because the resistance is as revealing as the imposition. The Schiller Institute, an international cultural organization, has campaigned for decades to restore A equals 432 Hz as the concert pitch standard. Their arguments are not just acoustic, they're physiological. They argue that 432-based tuning produces less vocal strain in singers, less fatigue in instrumentalists, and a sonic environment that is less agitating to the nervous system than 440-based tuning. opera singers have reported that Verdi pitch tuning, A equals 432, which was the standard that Giuseppe Verdi himself advocated, allows them to perform with less strain and greater vocal longevity than 440 tuning. Verdi wasn't advocating for 432 because of mysticism. He was advocating because the human voice works better at the lower pitch, because the vocal apparatus, which evolved to produce sound in a natural acoustic environment, performs optimally at a tuning standard that aligns with natural resonances rather than industrial requirements. The deeper I went into the vocal research, the more I found that the shift from 432 to 440 didn't just change how music sounds, it changed how music feels to produce. Singers work harder at 440. The vocal cords are under more tension. The effort required to produce the same perceived volume is greater. The long-term vocal health consequences of performing at 440 versus 432 have never been systematically studied because the 440 standard is treated as a given rather than as a variable. But the anecdotal and preliminary evidence consistently points in the same direction. 432 is easier on the voice. 440 is harder. The human vocal apparatus, like the human ear, like the human nervous system, like the human body that is 60% water and that vibrates sympathetically with every frequency it encounters, performs differently at different tuning standards. And the standard that was chosen in 1939 wasn't chosen because it was optimal for the body. It was chosen because it was optimal for the broadcast infrastructure. I'm not telling you that 440 Hz is a weapon. I'm not telling you that the Nazis designed a frequency to damage the human mind. I'm telling you that a tuning standard that had been centered near 432 Hz for centuries was replaced in a single decade with a different standard. That the replacement was driven by industrial requirements, not acoustic or physiological research. That the new standard produces cymatic patterns that are measurably less ordered than the old standard. That the mathematical difference between the two standards corresponds to a frequency at the boundary of the brain's own operating ranges, that the old standard aligns with natural harmonics and mathematical constants that the new standard doesn't, that singers perform with less strain at the old standard, that the body processes the two standards differently. I'm asking why a change that affected every piece of music heard by every person in the industrialized world was made without public debate, without physiological research, and without the consent of the musicians or the audiences who would live inside the new standard for the rest of their lives. I'm asking what music sounded like before 1934, what it felt like in the body, what it did to the nervous system, what the concert halls of Vienna and Milan sounded like when the instruments were tuned 8 Hz lower and the air vibrated at a frequency that the ancient world encoded into the measurements of its most sacred structures. I'm asking what you've never heard. What frequency has been playing in every song you've ever loved, 8 Hz higher than it was supposed to be, close enough to feel right, far enough to feel like something is missing that you can never quite name.